Professor Laird here, and this is the video lecture for Chapter 6 in the American Government class, looking at the President's office and the President's powers. First of all, let's look at how the President is elected, and that's through the Electoral College, which you've touched on a little bit before already in the section on the Constitution. The President is elected by a majority of the electoral votes. We'll look at how those are divided out here in a minute. He has to win a majority of the electoral votes, 270 out of the 538 total electoral votes. We talked a little bit in a previous lecture about what inspired the 12th Amendment, which modified the Electoral College somewhat, but we still have to deal with the majority of those Electoral College votes. The number is actually determined by total 435 House of Representatives members plus the 100 Senate members plus 3 more for the District of Columbia, and that's where the 538 total electoral votes comes from. Every state in the United States, except for 2 states, have this winner-take-all technique where whoever gets the plurality of the popular vote within that state is going to get all of the electoral votes. They're all going to go into that pot for that particular candidate. States decided to do this over the years because it gives each state a little bit more power as far as the influence they can have on the presidential election. If all of their electoral votes are going to go into the pot for that president, then the president might pay more attention to that state in the campaign. And then otherwise, it would just be a proportional representation that would be similar to the popular vote. So that's what makes the Electoral College controversial and different from the popular vote, to agree that there's been 5 elections where the president that won the popular vote did not win the election because they did not have a majority of the electoral votes. Every 10 years we have a census, and that's when the representation, particularly in the House of Representatives, has to get adjusted. We've capped the number of representatives for quite a while at 435 as far as the House of Representatives goes. It'll stay at that number unless we add a new state. So therefore, with each census every 10 years, there's an adjustment. And as you can see, in the 2020 census, there was several states that lost 1 electoral vote because of population shifts. Several states added 1 electoral vote, such as Oregon, Montana, Colorado, North Carolina, Florida. In Texas, because of the shifting population down to the south, gained 2 electoral votes from the 2020 census. And here's the shift showing since 1970. It's fairly clear that there is a population shift from the upper Midwest, Northeast down to the south. And you can see the differences there as over the years, New York, since 1970, has lost 13 electoral votes, while Texas has gained 14 electoral votes. Here's the current numbers. The big heavyweights are, of course, California at 54 electoral votes. Texas now at 40. Florida now at 30. New York at 28. These states are generally leaning one way or the other. So the swing states are those that have a pretty significant amount of electoral votes that may not be completely leaning one direction or another. So therefore, the campaign might spend more time and attention on states such as Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, perhaps Michigan, states like that, Ohio, which have a significant chunk of electoral votes, but may not be leaning completely one way or the other towards a party. Here's the 2020 election results, where the Democratic presidential candidate, Joe Biden, got 306 electoral votes. You can see how that's divided up. See right there where Nebraska and Maine, the only two states that allow their electoral votes to be split. Nebraska leaned 4-1 to the Republican, Maine 3-1 towards the Democrat. Let's talk about the expressed powers of the president. These are the powers that are given to the president in the Constitution, which we've already touched on several of these. The president, according to the Constitution, is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. It's a very common democratic principle to have civilian control, elected civilians in control of the military, to have that separation of power so that diplomatic forces are used before we decide to go to military. And the president cannot declare war. We made that pretty clear when we looked at the Constitution, that Congress has the power to declare war. Now, we'll talk about some of the expanded powers of the president here in a few minutes, which have led to us getting into wars that were not declared by Congress. More expressed powers of the president. On the judicial side of things, he can appoint the Supreme Court justices. They have to get approved by the Senate. There's been quite a bit of activity in the last few years. Previous President Trump was responsible for appointing several Supreme Court justices. They also appoint all the federal judges that come up for vacancy during their administration. Federal judges are appointed for life, but if they die or retire for some reason, then that opening comes up. The president makes that appointment, and they get approved by the Senate. The president also has the power in the Constitution to grant pardons and reprieves to various people for various reasons that they may petition the president's office, that they may have been unjustly convicted of a crime, and they are maybe under suspicion. One of the most famous pardons, of course, is when President Ford, upon taking office, pardoned the previous President Nixon for any crimes that may have been committed, so that kind of stopped the investigations. Another power the president has given to him by the Constitution is to appoint all the ambassadors to all the other countries in the world that go and represent the United States and in their foreign consulates there. The president is the face of the nation, so he sends those messages out by way of the ambassadors, and he receives foreign ambassadors. So again, the president is the only person that's elected by the entire country, so to speak. So he is the face of the nation and represents the United States to the rest of the world. He also negotiates the treaties as a result. He usually sends a representative to do that, and they iron out the details, and the treaty gets signed, and then that treaty has to come back and get approved by the Senate by a 2/3 vote. And we'll talk about, because of the difficulty of that happening, that has given the president some motivations for additional powers that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. More powers given to the president by the Constitution. These are probably the ones that the president has the most influence on, because he is head of the executive branch. He is called the chief executive. He appoints all the officials in the executive branch. And as we'll see in the next chapter, the executive branch is quite large and has quite a bit of responsibility, and the president is the head of that entire branch. He appoints all the department heads of all the various cabinet departments and other various agencies, as well as several of the undersecretaries of a lot of these agencies as well. The president also has the power to fill vacancies during a recess of Congress, which doesn't happen very often, but the president could potentially try to abuse this power and slip somebody in to an appointment that the Senate has already sent out signals that they do not like or would not approve, but the president go ahead and puts them in during that recess. Now, the Constitution does say that position will expire at the end of the next term, so that it is limited as a result. Now, of course, as the president being the head of the executive branch, they are charged with faithfully executing the laws. This is part of our separation of powers. Congress makes the laws and then sends them over to the president's departments to execute those laws. They implement, they enforce, they monitor those laws. On the legislative side of things, the president sets the tone for what legislative direction that the country's going to take during his term. The president sets the agenda. He was elected by the entire United States, so he can therefore stand up in front of Congress and say, look, Congress, all of America, perhaps a majority of the population, they elected me because of what I told them that I wanted to do, so now let's start doing it. And the Constitution actually requires that the president give a State of the Union address to each Congress. He has the power to convene Congress when it's not in session for an emergency. He even has the power to adjourn Congress if something's going on that he doesn't like. Now, again, these are fairly rare occurrences and are probably getting even more rare in today's complicated world. The president also has the power to veto a bill that was passed by both houses of Congress. We talked about that process earlier when we looked at Congress and how the path that a bill takes in order to become law. Once the president vetoes it, however, Congress can override that veto with a 2/3 vote in both houses, because if it's a fairly popular bill that both houses really want by a very large majority, they can do that, because the president might be kind of at odds with what the rest of the country wants, or could be stubborn, whatever. So those are some express powers of the president. Now, as far as veto goes, vetoes have been getting increasingly less over the years. They kind of peaked during the Roosevelt and Truman administrations during World War II and coming out of World War II, and then they have progressively, in general, kind of decreased, whereas over the last 3 administrations, they've been pretty rare. Probably one of the reasons why is because Congress has not been as productive as it used to be. So there's less opportunities for the president to veto. And the overriding of the veto is also becoming more rare as well, because of the difficulty for either one of the houses to get 2/3 of majority to agree on anything. So those are some of the trends we see right there. The president's powers have also get a lot of attention, a lot of controversy, a lot of ammunition here for political cartoons. When Obama was elected, one of the main goals of that administration was to provide some health care reform. It was referred to as Obamacare, and it was immediately attacked by the opposing party. Several lawsuits went to court. One went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled in President Obama's favor in order to maintain that individual mandate, in order to provide funding for the subsidies to people that could not afford health care or insurance premiums. And then in the previous administration under Donald Trump, Congress passed a tax bill that actually ended the individual mandate, which lowered some of the participation somewhat. Now, the inherent power of the president simply means that because of what the Constitution tasks the president to do, there's some inferred powers that don't necessarily need to be written in order to get the job done. This was actually articulated in a Supreme Court ruling back in 1890 that the rights, duties, and obligations of the presidency entail some things that might not be specifically written down, such as in an emergency, the president may have to invoke certain things in times of conflict or emergency or disasters, as far as calling out National Guard or releasing funds to help people in need. So those are some things that are somewhat implied. Another one is what is called prosecutorial discretion, was in the process of executing the laws, they may decide to use more discretion on this particular law than they would on some other law. That was one of the things that was taken into account for the Dreamers Act when, under President Obama, decided not to prosecute children of illegal immigrants that would then allow them to go to college. So that was using the president's discretion to, literally direct the Homeland Security not to go after a certain group of people. And so that is just an inherent power of how they decide to implement that law, or how much or less they decide to enforce a law, that sort of thing. President, of course, is the only office elected by all of the people. So that's going to give them a little bit more implied power anyway, because they have more reach to more people. But now let's talk about some of the truly major expanded powers of the president. Before we get into three of the major expanded powers of the president, we'll talk about some things that are progressed over the years. Andrew Jackson was quite kind of a landmark presidency in creating more power, that the president was more of just a chief executive prior to that, but Jackson took it to the next level. Jackson won the popular vote as far as could be determined in the 1824 election, but he did not win the electoral vote. It went into the House, and there was some deals made, and John Quincy Adams was elected president through that House of Representatives process. Jackson was very disappointed, to say the least. He resigned from the Senate immediately and started running for president immediately for the 1828 election. And during that time, he amassed a lot of popular support, hence the first truly populist president that appealed to the anger and resentment and emotions of the people that felt like that he was denied the election, and really organized the Democratic Party through quite a large effort there to amass the power that he needed to win the presidency, and then immediately fired almost everyone in government and started creating this cronyism, what is called the spoil system, by filling all the offices with loyalists. That really expanded the power of the presidency and was quite controversial. Jackson history has not treated him very favorably as a result, and a lot of reforms followed in order to try to kind of downplay some of the power that Jackson amassed as president, particularly the spoil system, because as we get in the late 1800s, laws were passed that prevented the president from stacking the bureaucracy with loyalists and sycophants that would help him get reelected. That we have the civil service system as a result. Now, there's not a whole lot of argument that during war, president's powers expand quite a bit in order to try to win that war. Lincoln went through quite a bit of effort to try to win that Civil War in order to keep the Union intact. He ran through a lot of laws while the southern states were not there. He enacted martial law. The amount of tax revenue that was collected during the war is still the biggest percent increase in history. Woodrow Wilson also took on additional powers during World War I, and Franklin Roosevelt, particularly during the Depression and World War II, took on a considerable amount of power in order to try to beef up the economy for the war effort, to focus on military production in order to provide the resources that were needed to win the war. Now, these powers, much of them recede afterward, but there is kind of that stretched rubber band effect. When you stretch out a rubber band really far, it does not retract all the way back to its original position. So that's kind of what happens there. Those powers, particularly in the war effort, recede, but some of those things that were put in place that to help the war effort, some of those will stay in place. And so the power of the president has expanded somewhat. But let's talk about three primary expanded powers that have really come into play over the last several decades. One of these is the blanket resolutions authorizing the use of military force. They are often called AUMF, authorization to use military force. This is where Congress has given the president somewhat of a blank check in order to take care of a problem with the intent of trying to prevent war from happening. But in order to try to take care of this conflict by any means necessary, because that is the wording that's put in there, take care of this problem, Mr. President, and you are authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force in order to take care of this problem. Well, one thing leads to another, and that problem is very difficult to take care of, so the use of this force starts to escalate, and then it turns into full-scale war, even though that was not Congress's intent, and it was not a declared war. But in order to try to take care of this problem, the president's given power as commander-in-chief, it escalates. Plus, the president wants to be perceived favorably by winning that conflict that is now escalated into a war. And by not winning this conflict, they will probably not get reelected. So then it becomes even more of a necessity for the president to do what they need in order to win this thing, and it may not even be winnable. There's been several examples. The Korean War was not declared by Congress, but they went through the UN on that, but that one still ended in pretty much of a stalemate. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, this goes to show you how avid the congressional support is, and then it quickly escalates into full-scale war and then becomes quite unpopular. The Vietnam War, there was a 416-0 vote in the House for the President Johnson to take care of that problem in Vietnam, 88-2 in the Senate. But within just a few short years, that had escalated into a full-scale war, and by 1968, it was so out of control that, and did not seem to be winnable at the way that they were doing it, President Johnson literally decided not to run for re-election. And members of his own party were already entering into the primaries to run against him on the platform of ending the war in Vietnam. So President Johnson just literally bailed out because it was eating his lunch, this war. The Gulf War resolution was actually more controversial, but yet that one ended quite a bit more quickly than these other conflicts. There was relatively little death and destruction with respect to America's interest. Obviously, Kuwait suffered quite a bit of damage from the invasion of Iraq, but within a few months, we were able to push Saddam Hussein back out of it, and that one was resolved fairly quickly. But we know that 10 or so years later, the administration in power did not think the job was done. We'll get to that here in a second, because 9/11 resulted in the War on Terror resolution. As you can see, overwhelming support in both houses of Congress, and therefore we went into Afghanistan to try to take care of Al-Qaeda. Of course, had to topple the Taliban first, and then stayed there for 20 years. And then literally before we get fully out of the country, the Taliban has assumed control of the country again. So obviously mixed results with that one, as well as the Iraq War. Again, pretty strong support for the Iraq War resolution. About 2/3 of Americans, as well as Congress, were in support of that. But within 2 years, that had completely flipped because of how badly the Iraq War was going, the amount of death and destruction, and it looked like it had devolved into a sectarian civil war that we got caught in the middle of. That within a few years, it had kind of stabilized. Then the United States was somewhat asked to leave. We still have a small presence there, but clearly the results of the Iraq War were mixed at best. So these are some examples of blanket resolutions. This is one of the 3 major expanded powers that we're going to talk about here, that the president has picked up more powers over the past century, perhaps more so than what the framers of the Constitution had expected. The War Powers Resolution in 1973, as the Vietnam War was winding down, was an attempt to try to get more congressional control over this situation. They provided strict conditions for war. The president had to consult Congress before sending troops, and the troops are deployed no more than 60 days. Now, these 2 provisions here are fairly easily worked around because the president can send a lot of resources to that region and doesn't even have to send it to that country. They can send it to an ally. A lot of resources, a lot of advisors, a lot of reconnaissance type of stuff, a lot of equipment. So there's a lot of things that the president can do before they officially consult with Congress. And then if they deploy a lot of manpower and it takes them literally 2 months to get everybody there, it's not likely that Congress is going to say, okay, now that you're there and you spent 2 full months trying to get 500,000 troops there, now we want you to send them back. That is really not practical. And this was the deal killer right here. Congress said that we can withdraw troops if we don't think it's going well. However, this, was termed as a legislative veto, this violates the separation of powers in the Constitution, and this went to the Supreme Court, and it was struck down, found to be unconstitutional, so Congress does not have that power. So this War Powers Resolution, Nixon vetoed it, not surprisingly, because most any president, regardless of their party, would probably veto that because it would encroach into their power as commander-in-chief. And Congress overrode that veto, but as I've shown here, this War Powers Resolution was ineffective and obviously did not prevent the other activities that I've already talked about since that time. Now, the president is also, the powers of the president are subject to a lot of controversy and political cartooning. As we get out of the war in Iraq, we had to step up our surveillance, particularly with trying to catch terrorists. So a lot of pushback on that activity. The Obama surveillance program got just as much criticism as the Bush surveillance program, perhaps even more, because the Obama administration had to step up the surveillance because we were no longer using the ground war technique. We were using more drones, more surveillance. So that was kind of a substitute for the ground war activity. So it's very difficult, take care of these types of problems without a lot of controversy and scrutiny push back. This is the second of our 3 expanded powers that I want to talk about, and that is executive agreements that have literally replaced the international treaty. What the president does is make an international compact with another country or a fairly small group of countries, or could potentially agree to a large global accord without Senate approval. Because in most cases, or an overwhelming number of those cases, it's going to be difficult for the president to get that 2/3 majority approval of the Senate. So they just make these international compacts that has the same effects of a treaty, particularly during his or her administration. And that gives the president the credibility to make these agreements without having to deal with this potentially never-ending approval process, as well as being undermined by the Senate that might reject that agreement. So over the past 10 or 15 years, there's only been 2 or 3 actual treaties that have been approved by the Senate, and those were fairly routine extradition treaties with one country. There's been a couple of examples to where the president, for example, the Paris Accords, with respect to a global agreement, the Obama administration had agreed to that, but because it is not officially approved by the Senate, it does not have the force of law, and then the subsequent president can literally tear up that agreement. The Supreme Court started to uphold the legal status of these agreements because of the fact of the president, as the face of the nation, had to conduct business and not get handcuffed by the Senate. So this was one of the earlier cases under the Roosevelt administration in preparing for World War II. When the majority of the country was wanting to stay out of World War II, the president knew that it was quite possible that we would have to get involved in order to save Britain from losing. And that would have been disastrous for a democracy, what was remaining of the democracy in Europe. So they had to start getting prepared. The Destroys for Bases Agreement was another one of these that the president made without Senate approval, but the courts had generally been acceptable of those agreements for the president to conduct his business as the face of the nation, is responsible for negotiating with other countries and commander-in-chief, that sort of thing. So almost all of the international agreements are these things, executive agreements, instead of the official treaties. The Senate-approved international treaty, as I said, is becoming extremely rare. However, these executive agreements are easier to undo by the next president that may not agree with about, more than likely, if it's a different party, they could just totally tear those up, such as what President Trump did with the Paris Accords, as well as the agreement with Iran on their nuclear program. That was also torn up by the subsequent president. If it was an official treaty approved by 2/3 of the Senate, a president couldn't do that. It would have to be, it's law, and the only way that could be changed is going through Congress. But this is yet another one of these powers that has expanded over the years for the president. The third one that I want to talk about is the executive order, which is typically a routine thing for the president to make some sort of change within the executive branch, a new rule, and it has the formal status of legislation. Even though it's not a law passed by Congress, it's a rule that the executive branch has to follow. And the executive branch is large, and it also deals with a huge amount of the public sector. For example, when the Obama administration had set up an executive order to raise the minimum wage for all government contractors. That affected about 10 million people whose wages would raise. If they were making minimum wage, their wages would raise in accordance to this executive order. And most of these executive orders have a lot to do with sanctions on other countries because the president's power controls the banks, the Treasury Department to freeze the assets of a foreign country because they're not doing what we want them to do. So we'll put a sanction on them by freezing their assets or raising tariffs on them, which the president can do through various executive agencies. So this typically has to do with procedures, the organizational structure, personnel. But like I said, because the executive branch is so large and deals with a large sector of the public, or can have very important ramifications to foreign countries, this gives the president yet more power through these executive orders. So these are three types of expanded powers that the president has been gaining over the past half century or more. As far as the number of executive orders, they peaked with Harry Truman coming out of World War II. He basically restructured the entire executive branch as we were preparing to deal with the Soviet Union. As far as Donald Trump goes, he was on par to have a few more than average throughout his first term, as well as Joe Biden had 77 in his first. And this is indicative of the fact that presidents, or at least they're feeling like they're put into position of having to do more executive orders because of the lack of activity of Congress. We've already talked about that in the previous chapter. We've already mentioned that there's less legislative activity than there used to be. It is more difficult for Congress to come to an agreement on things. It's typically very partisan driven type of policy when it does get out. So the president, particularly if they are on the opposite party of the Congress, they may feel like that they, in order to get some things done, they may have to do more of these executive orders. So that is one of the reasons why the activity is perhaps starting to pick back up a little bit due to that. Another potentially expanded power, but not as effective as those three that we've talked about, is what is called executive privilege, where the president will claim immunity from scrutiny or from being charged with overuse of his power because he needs to do things somewhat secretively, that I got to get these things done without being hounded by Congress. As my power as chief executive, I have the privilege to do these things without scrutiny. However, that doesn't always hold up. The Supreme Court ruled against Richard Nixon when he tried to claim executive privilege to not turn over the tapes during an active investigation. And then also the charges against former President Trump. He is claiming executive privilege on several of those, and some of those have already been shot down and may get shot down still more as far as those investigations are going. So not as much as an expanded power as those other three that we talked about. But kind of the general tone that surrounds these expanded powers of the president is because our society is getting bigger. It's becoming more complex. There's more things that government agencies need to do to satisfy the demands of people out there in the world that may need help or may be not getting everything that they need from the capitalist market out there. So therefore, the president has to delegate more power to the executive branch to get things done. There's no way on earth that a president can know everything that's going on when he has 3 million people that work for him, that are doing all kinds of activities out there in the United States and abroad in order to try to conduct the business of government. So that alone that expanding bureaucracy, that increasing delegation, gives that president's office still more increasing power. And the fact that bills cannot be thousands of pages of length in order to tell the president this is exactly what you need to do. Now, Congress passes bills that try to give the president as much direction as they can practically give, but the president then has to go in there and enact that bill into law when there's a lot of blank spaces, right? There's a lot of fill in the blanks. There's a lot of what we call statutory vagueness that the president's departments have to interpret in order to put that bill into law out there to the public for them to abide by. So that alone gives the president's offices there, and the president himself, because he's the boss of all that, gives them a little bit more power that kind of incrementally goes. The reduction in the power of Congress, we've already talked about that. The reduction in the popularity of Congress, that literally gives the president a little bit more opportunity to increase his power. And because the president is the only person selected by the entire United States, it gets considerably more attention during the elections than any other office. And perhaps a lot of that gives more symbolic power to the president that is really unrealistic for the president to live up to these expectations, the media coverage that's put on that, the presidential campaign promises that the candidates make in order to get elected. There's no way that they can fulfill all of these promises when they have to rely on Congress to pass the laws. So therefore, there's just extremely unrealistic expectations that are put on a president even before he takes office because of all this symbolic power. And as a result, every president that has been elected over the past half century, their approval ratings start to decline almost immediately. As you can see here, it fluctuates in many cases, but in almost every case, there's been a serious decline in the president's approval rating. Obviously, George Bush took a massive hit as a result of the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, them not going very well as the tanking economy. His father, George Bush Sr., took a massive hit in his approval ratings with the recession. And then even Obama took a big hit very early on, but then recouped a little bit of popularity. Trump was very low to begin with, but actually dipped even lower still. And Biden also took a big hit in his approval ratings right off the bat because of these expectations that aren't met. And of course, that's somewhat of an unreasonable public that we're dealing with as well, that elects a president expecting him to do all these things and then get disappointed when he doesn't do them, and then the approval ratings drop quite quickly. So that's what's unrealistic about it. But this was the video lecture on the president's office. We talked about what powers he was given in the Constitution, as well as those major expanded powers that the president has picked up over the years that may not have been intended by the framers of the Constitution. So stay tuned for the discussion forum following the video lecture.